Alright guys, welcome back. In this segment, we'll delve into the intricacies of referencing workbooks, worksheets, and ranges within our code. Currently, we have two workbooks open for demonstration purposes. The first workbook serves as our primary workspace. This is where we'll be writing our codes, and it has a single worksheet named OneSource. The second workbook, which is open in the background, is named Destination, and it has one worksheet named OneDestination. Alright? So our objective today is to establish a connection between these two workbooks using programming techniques. Okay, so we want to link these two workbooks together. So you have to remember, whenever you are linking a workbook, right, you have to make sure the workbook is open in the background. Okay, if I am referencing another workbook from this workbook, then when I run the macro, the workbook that I'm referencing has to be opened in the background. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to insert a module, and we'll start with something simple, and then we will go on to more advanced materials. Okay. Right. So I'm just going to name this procedure. Okay. I want to reference this workbook. Okay, that's the first thing I'm going to do. The workbook where I'm writing my macro. Okay, how do I do that? I'm just going to say dim my workbook as workbook. Okay, and I'm going to use the keyword set. Remember the three main objects, right? Workbook, worksheet, and ranges, right? So set my workbook equals to this. I could simply use this workbook. Okay. Now I can just debug dot print my workbook dot name. Okay. It should return me the name of my workbook. Okay. So I've named this workbook as reference workbook and worksheets. Okay. I've named it, and it has the extension XLSM. Right. The other one is destination.xlsm. So the difference between XLSM and XLSX is that XLSX are workbooks without macros. XLSM are workbooks that have macros in it. Okay, so remember that. XLSX, XLSM. Right, so now I'm just going to step into the code, F8, and we have the name of our workbook, which is this workbook. Okay, the workbook where I'm writing my codes in. Okay, so we've done that. Now, we want to reference an active workbook. The workbook that is currently active. Okay, so remember, at any given time, you can only have one workbook, one worksheet, and one cell active. You may have multiple workbooks selected. You could have multiple worksheets selected. You could have multiple cells selected. But if you have the word active, only one object in that collection can be active at any given time, right? So I'm just going to say dim active at book. Okay, I'll just name it that way, as workbook. Remember, as a collection, right? The workbook object, so set at book. Use the keyword set. Okay, I'm just going to say active workbook. Debug dot print at book.name. Now, I'm just going to set a breakpoint here by hitting F9, and then I'm going to run the code by hitting F5. So we've reached the breakpoint, and now I'm going to hit F8 to see what the results are. So the active workbook, meaning the workbook that I'm on currently, is this workbook. So what if I have this workbook? I have a cell selected on the other workbook. Now this workbook is active, right? So if the active cell is on the other workbook, then that workbook will be active. If the active cell is on this workbook, if I've selected one of the cells, the last cell that I've selected is on this workbook, then this workbook will be active. If the last cell that I've selected is on the other workbook, then the other workbook is active. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, I have this one selected. I'm going to go back to the Visual Basic application, right? So, I'm going to reset, and then I'm going to reset this. So if you want to remove the breakpoint, just click on the red button again, and it's going to get reset. Okay, so I'm going to set a breakpoint here, F9. We're going to do the same thing. We're just going to clear everything here. Then I'm going to hit F5. Okay, we're going to run the code. Okay, F5. So I've reached the breakpoint, and now, as you could see, the active workbook is destination, right? It's the other workbook where I had my where I selected a cell on it. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now we set the macro, so we already know what is active workbook. Let's go into referencing another workbook, right? Referencing a workbook outside where the macro is written. So currently my macro is written on this workbook, reference workbook and worksheet, but I want to reference the workbook destination. So how we're going to do that? It's going to say dim other workbook as workbook. And then I'm going to say set other workbook simply as workbooks and the workbook name with the extension, alright? And wrap it around with a double inverted comma. Now I'm going to debug dot print other workbook dot name. Okay, so I'm going to clear this. I'm going to set a breakpoint F9, and then we're going to run the macro hitting F. Okay, variable is not defined because I have made a typo here. Okay, so that's why you have to use option explicit. Let's set a breakpoint again, F9, and then I'm going to hit F5. I'm just going to clear all of this, F8, and we have referenced the second workbook. Okay, but you have to make sure when you reference the workbook outside where the macro is written, that workbook has to be open on the background. Okay, keep that in mind. Okay, so now let us reference worksheet within this workbook. So if you're referencing a worksheet within the workbook where your macro is written, you could use the code name. So remember, this is the code name, this is the tab name. So you have the liberty of using the code name when you're referencing a worksheet within the workbook where you're writing a macro. But in any other instances, if you're referencing a worksheet that is outside where you're writing your macro, outside the workbook where you're writing the macro, for instance, I'm referencing this sheet 1 on destination, I have to use the tab name. Okay, so I can say I can use code name. And what's the code name here? It's sheet 1, not one source. Okay, so that's how we're going to do it. I'm going to dim worksheet as worksheet, and then I'm just going to say we use the code name set worksheet equals to sheet 1, and then I'm going to debug dot print worksheet dot name. Okay, so I'm just going to set a breakpoint here, F9. We're going to come here, we're going to run it, and then we're just going to clear everything, and then we're going to go F8, and we have, then it's returning us the tab name of this worksheet 1. Okay, it's returning us the tab name. Okay, so that's how we reference worksheet within the same workbook. Now let's reference worksheet from another workbook. Okay, workbook outside where the macro is written. Okay, the way we have to do it is I'm going to just say dim other sheet as worksheet, and then set other sheet as simply workbooks. What's the workbook name? Destination with the extension. Do not forget the extension. Dot worksheets, and the tab name of the worksheet, which is one destination. And that's all. You could also do it this way, set other sheet. Since we already know the workbooks, that the other workbook, right? We have already referenced it here. So we have named it other workbook, right? You can also do it other workbook dot worksheets one destination, right? So generally I prefer to use the second approach because it's just more systematic instead of having it all on a single line. That's really up to you, okay? I just prefer to go with the second one. So we're going to test it. I'm just going to say debug.print other sheet name, and then I'm just going to set a breakpoint here, F9, and then we're going to run the code, F5, and then we're just going to clear everything, and then F8, and we have the name of the workbook, right? So the worksheet, which is one destination, right? So likewise, you can also use this one. I told you could use this one as well. So we can just test that as well, just to make sure, you know. So I'm just going to hit a break point there. And then I'm going to run the code. And then we're going to hit F8 and we have the same results. Okay, one destination. Okay, so what's next? Let's reference active worksheet. Okay, we have spoken about active workbook. Now let's talk about active worksheet. Okay, so active worksheet is the worksheet that is currently active. Keep that in mind. Okay, it could be from this workbook or from another workbook, depending on which sheet you have selected. Right? If my last action was to select this cell on one source, then this worksheet is active. Right? If my last action was to reference this cell, then that would be my active worksheet, which is one destination, right? So keep that in mind. Now we're just going to say dim my sheet as worksheet. And then I'm going to say set my sheet equals to active worksheet. Active sheet. Okay, it should be active sheet, and then debug dot print active sheet dot name. Right. So now I'm going to set a breakpoint. Okay, before I set a breakpoint, I'm just going to be active on this sheet, on the second workbook destination. Right. So let's hit a breakpoint now, and then just F5 to run the macro. It stops at the breakpoint. Now I hit F8. See, it's giving me one destination, right? But what if I'm gonna reset the macro first? What if this is now my active worksheet, right? I've selected the cell on this sheet, on the workbook where I'm writing my macro, right? So now, if I set a breakpoint by hitting F9, and then I run the code by hitting okay, what's going on? Okay, F5 and then F8 to get one source. Okay, that's the worksheet that was active, right? I selected the cell from that worksheet. Okay, so keep that in mind on active sheet, right? It's the cell that you are active. The last cell that you're active, and the sheet of the last cell that you're active, that will be your active sheet. Now let's reference range in the workbook where my macro sits or reside. Okay, so basically I'm referring to the range in sheet 1, right? Because I only have one sheet. So for that, I'm going to say dim rng as range. Then I have to use the keyword set rng equals to, I can use a code name, right? I can use a code name because the worksheet and the macro are on the same workbook. Keep that in mind, okay? And then I'm just going to have some value, 20, populated onto it. So you might ask me, right? What if I just leave it as range A5 to B20 instead of having it this way? Well, if you have it as range A5 to B20, whenever you run the macro is going to affect the sheet that you are on, either on this worksheet or on the second worksheet. Okay, you have to keep in mind that whenever you view your macro, you can view all the macros that are on. You can view all the macros on all the workbooks that are open. Okay, so it's not localized to viewing the macro that exists on the workbook where you have it on, right? For example, if you have 2 macros on this workbook and 2 macros on the second workbook, it's not that you're going to see only 2 macros on this workbook, right? Where you have written your codes on. You'll be able to see all 4 macros. See, I'm on destination. I don't have any macros written in it, but I could see all the macros. Okay, I could see the macros on the other workbook, right? Right. So you have the option of just narrowing it down to this workbook, right? And all open workbooks, so you can view all your macros and run it. Okay, keep that in mind. Right. So that's why I have it as sheet 1. Otherwise, if I leave it arranged, it's just going to affect the worksheet that I'm currently active on, either this workbook or the other workbook, right? Whatever workbook that's open in the background. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to range on another workbook. Okay, outside where my macro is written. For that, I'm just going to say dim rng2 as range. I'm going to use the I'm going to use the keyword set rng2. So instead of having the name workbooks dot worksheets, etc., I already have the other worksheet name, so I could just use it this way, right? Other sheet, right? Dot range. Then I can just use the same range. Then rng2. This is going to be 40. Okay, make sure you use the keyword set. Okay, make sure you use the keyword set. So I've not run this macro yet. So before we even proceed, let's run the macro. Okay, let's run the macro to test it. Okay, now if I go back, I'll be able to see 20 on A5 to B20. Okay, so that's from this one. Okay, now we're going to uncomment it, uncomment this section, and we are going to populate 40 onto the other sheet. So 40 has been populated onto the other workbook, right? The other range of this sheet. So the reason I left it, I have it this way, because other sheet is nothing but actually the other workbook, which is workbooks dot worksheet one destination, right? That's the other sheet, right? So you could actually do it this way if you want, right? If you don't have it referenced, then this is how you should be doing. Set rng2 equals to this way, then you have the range. You can just use some other range, right? I can just say E20 to F40. Okay, make sure there's no overlap. Okay, and then I can just comment this out. Okay, I have to use the keyword set, not ser. Okay, right? So now if I run it, okay, and I go to my second workbook, I can see, right? Yeah. So this is the way to actually write it, but since I've already referenced the other sheet as workbooks.worksheets, I could simplify it that way. Okay. So now let's talk about range on active sheet. Okay. So I'm going to say dim rng3 as range, and then I'm going to say rng3 set, right? You have to use the keyword set. rng3 equals to active sheet dot range some maybe x15 to y20. Okay, so rng3 is going to be just some value 50. Now this one is going to affect whichever active sheet that I'm on, right? So this is my active sheet. Okay, now I'm on this sheet. I selected the cell from this sheet. Now if I run the macro, variable not defined, obviously because there is a typo. Okay, there is a typo. So I'm going to run it again. And I'm going to see reference workbook on X, right? There's something on X to Y, right? Because this was the worksheet that was active. Now, if I'm on the other worksheet, so I selected a cell from the other worksheet, I go to my macros, and I run it, I'll be able to see that results populated on the sheet that I'm active. So that's active sheet. That is active sheet. But you can also exclude this active sheet, right? Even if you exclude this active sheet, Excel's going to assume that the range you're affecting is a range on your active sheet. Okay? So keep that in mind. You can test it out yourself, okay? Never mind. Let's just test it out here, right? The range 4. We have time. Right? We have time. Set RNG4 equals to just range. I'm just gonna say D50 to E70. Okay? And RNG4 equals to some value, maybe 100. Okay? So it's affecting D50 to E70. And this is going to affect any, it's the equivalent of this. It's the equivalent of this, right? It's going to just affect whatever active sheet that you're on. So if I go to RN, if I just be on this sheet now, and I run the macro, remember you can view all the macros on all the workbooks, right? So you are not localized to viewing the macros within the workbook that you're on. Okay, keep that in mind. You can view all the macros on all open workbooks at any given time. So I'm going to go to my macros once again, and I'm going to run it. I'm going to see D5 to D70, right? So I'm on this sheet. So although I've not specified the active sheet, Excel is going to treat that as the active sheet. Now if I go destination, right? Now on this active sheet, I run the macro and I get the same results. Okay, so that's about it, guys, on referencing workbook, worksheet, and ranges. Okay, and you have to know when to use the code name, right? Code name is when the worksheet is on the same workbook where your macro is written. Otherwise, in any other instances, you have to reference it by the that name of the worksheet. Okay, the workbooks of the other workbook, you reference it this way with the extension. Okay, so that's about it, guys. I'll see you in the next lecture.